Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever and whenever you're watching, listening to this 12-step workshop from the Big Book. My name is Herb, and I'm an alcoholic, and this call is being recorded. Please join me in prayer for an open mind and an open heart. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Keeping in with the metaphor of the rocket launch, stage one was an experience of no choice, powerlessness, not sufficient power. Oh, we've got lots of willpower to do lots of things. But we discover, because we consciously look, that we don't do what we want to do, and we do what we don't want to do, and it's pretty consistent. Bill calls it unmanageability. I call it the human condition. And he says it manifests in the bedevilments. And the promises on pages 83 and 84 are a complete reversal, the other side, inside out, of those bedevilments. Just as a fun exercise, you might take a look at that page in step 9 in the Way of Life document that contrasts the bedevilments with the promises, line by line. Read it out loud and across. It's a powerful experience because it might help motivate you here in this second stage of the rocket launch, because it's difficult. We're looking at the instincts gone awry, and the first piece of that look is, from my standpoint and experience, the most difficult. We're looking at resentment. All three pieces in the Big Book are resentment and fear and sex, inappropriate sex, I'll add that word. Underneath that third component, I believe, is dishonesty. So then it really fits very nicely with how Bill lays it out in the 12 and 12, a slightly different model. He may have some psychological sophistication by that time, 10 years, 20 years later, from his sobriety date. He talks about instincts gone awry. And from biology and psychology, we know that the instincts, survival instincts, at the brain stem level, that first part developmentally of the brain that makes us specifically human, the brainstem is the first part that gives us the biological survival mechanisms of fight, flight, and freeze, fight, anger and resentment, flight, fear and anxiety, freeze, dishonesty, camouflage, secrets, hiding. Nothing wrong with these instincts. In fact, there's everything right about these instincts initially. They protect us for our survival. Biological survival. And then as we adopt and adapt them for our psychological survival, that's when things get a bit askew. So we look at resentments. Anger that's held for a period of time. You define what that means. It might be an hour, it might be 24. It's someplace in there. Not less than, not more than. Well, I'm making that up because that's not in the big book. But resentments are anger that's been held. Anger is just our reaction to being disturbed. Our initial reaction, it's to fight it, to not accept it. But it's our reaction. And we feel justified because we have beliefs. The lenses through which we look at reality. We don't know that we have lenses. The third column is an effort to look at those lenses. We're so used to looking through our lenses at reality that we don't know that those very lenses are what describes reality to us. And if the lenses are distorted, we get a distorted picture, and we can't do anything but get a distorted picture. And we don't know that we don't know, and we can't see that we don't see, and we can't see reality as it is. We see reality as we are. And it's a source of our suffering because we have expectations, we have beliefs. I am. You are. We should. The world should. Life should. It's my expectation. It's my story. And I don't know I have a story, but I'm convinced that my reaction is based on the truth. And what we discover in the third column is that there's a distortion. I am. Perhaps we've discovered some delusion. You are. Perhaps we've discovered a myth, an expectation that just isn't reality. It's something that we were either told or we made up. And we accepted it as truth. And when we think that it is true and we react as if it is true and it doesn't work and people react to us poorly, we blame them. And the third column is about seeing the truth. What is my belief? What is my story? What is the myth? What is the Hollywood stage front through which I'm looking at reality? I've built this Hollywood stage front. I just don't know that I have it. My persona, my facade, my mask. I built it as a protection. Stone by stone, block by block, I built these expectations, these beliefs, these stories, these myths, so that I could deal effectively, by my standards, with reality. Block by block. I built this wall to protect me, to survive. And now I'm discovering it didn't protect me, it imprisoned me. The wonderful mental image to help motivate us to now dismantle this wall, to have it disintegrate, so that in fact we are not in the jail, the prison of our story, that we live in the freedom of the truth. Reality as it is, more like it is, although we will never know what it is, because we will always look through lenses. And our lenses will always tell us what we see, but we don't see it as it is. We see it as our lenses are. I don't believe I've ever given a clearer perception of the third column than that, what we've just talked about. So we can do our best to analyze it. I mean, we have the ability to use our mind, certainly to use our step buddies, our accountability partners, our sponsors who may have some experience with this, to attempt to unpack it through use of the third column approach, those 7 words that we've given definitions to and instructions to as to how to attempt to unpack our beliefs in the third column, using the fear word after we've thought about it, those 7 words, and written out a statement of our beliefs, using the fear word to perhaps subtly explode in us a different perception, which is my experience. And then to see that we're powerless, really. And the big book so confirms that immediately. Page 65, 66, 67. He spends a page and a half, Bill does, and we looked at the removal of deep resentment, a prayer for that purpose. Bill suggests on page 66, at the end of that first or second paragraph, that we're as powerless to remove our anger, our resentment, as we are over alcohol. That's not subtle. We can name it, we can analyze it, we can describe it, we can talk about it, we can think about it, we can even absolutely accept the delusion of it all and attempt to see what the reality is. That's our job, actually, as thinking, rational human beings, as people on a spiritual path who are beginning to really wake up. That's our job. And yet Bill says, wow, in the final analysis, you can't get there from here on your own power. You're as powerless over removing the deep resentment as you are over your addiction. Yeah. So we craft a prayer. It's in the Way of Life document, the one that I've used recently, fine-tuned for this workshop. But it's in the Way of Life document in its current form. It's only about words, but it's really about the intent. So if in fact the words don't suit you, change them to fit your intent. Your intent, at least from the big book's invitation, is to invite divine intervention, to step in and remove, reduce, diminish, but eventually remove, excise surgically this deep resentment. And I suggested that you choose to look at your list of all of your resentments and select out the 1 or 2 or 5 or how many there are. Deep resentments. And begin that prayer practice. Now, some people will have, let's say, 3, and they will pray the prayer, 1 prayer for each of them every day. Please realize you're not praying for the person that you have a resentment for. You're praying for yourself. That's the instruction in the book. It's a wonderful spiritual practice to pray for other people. 5 or 10,000 years of tradition. It's a wonderful spiritual practice validated by historical experience. But that's not the instruction in this area. The instruction is to pray for yourself, to pray for divine intervention, to pray for the divine surgeon, to bring the surgical tools to remove the cancer in you so that it doesn't metastasize and eventually choke the life out of you. Not just spiritual life. These are the clouds that interfere with the sunlight of the spirit. We've used that metaphor many, many, many times. That's true. But resentment is a killer. Science has that pretty conclusively. Heart attacks, strokes, cancer, all kinds of mischief psychologically. Do your best to name it, to analyze it, to talk about it, to change, in fact, your reaction. Do the best that you can, knowing that you cannot, in the final analysis, accomplish it. The final piece of the deepest, deepest, deepest ones. And you'll need help. And some people will pray, if they have a list of 3, they'll pray just once for one person until that resentment appears to be mitigated or disappeared. And then they'll go on to the second person. You choose what you will do, not theoretically what Herb did or what your sponsor suggests. No, what will you do practically? Is it one prayer a day? Is it more than one prayer a day? Is it a prayer each day for each of the removal of each of the resentments? You'll figure that out. And then just continue it. Don't expect it to be happening by next Wednesday. It may. I can't predict that. But I know in my own case, I had 8 deep resentments, and I prayed the prayers each day, 8 of them actually. I took the time to pray for the removal, 8 different deep resentments, 8 different prayers every day. I'm not recommending it, I'm just sharing my experience. And it was 3 months before I was aware that one had been removed. And I knew it existentially, because when I prayed and thought about it, there was no negative energy around it. And I crossed it off, continuing to pray 7 prayers and then 6. And eventually they all went away. It was not a long period of time after the first one disappeared. The balance disappeared in a matter of weeks. And here's the magic, and I'll use that word. I don't use it very often. In any subsequent resentment list, none of those ones I prayed for ever came back. Wow. See, there's freedom. That's what we're looking for. And now we're going to look at the 4th column. And I call it the 4th column just because it's easy nomenclature. Even the use of the terms column 1, 2, and 3 is not in the big book, although it's illustrated literally in columns on page 65. They're not titled column 1, 2, and 3. But for ease of reference, we call them column 1, 2, and 3. And because of that, then, ease of reference, this final phase of the resentment inventory, page 67, this final paragraph here, the second full paragraph, I call column 4, referring to our list again. Well, what list is that? Oh, the first column list that we unpacked in 2nd and 3rd column. Putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done. So this is a complete reversal of our approach, because up till now we've looked at column 1, who did it? Column 2, what did they do? Column 3, and how did it impact me? It's all in one direction. Me as the center of abuse, of circumstances and people and events. But now we're looking at it from an entirely different angle, completely going from north to south to north. We're reversing the look, not what people, events, and circumstances did to me and how it impacted me, but looking at me and my reaction to circumstances, events, and people. Putting out of our minds the wrongs others have done. It's legitimate. It's true. We were betrayed. We were hurt. Sometimes it was certainly psychologically damaging and traumatic. Sometimes it was even criminal behavior. No, it's true. It did happen. It's just reality. We can never change our history. We can never change the truth of our story. Unfortunately, we make up a story to explain it that might not be true. And that's what we can change. And we can also change our reaction to the reality by reframing the story. Wonderful word. Reframing the story. That's what fourth column is all about. We resolutely look for our own mistakes. You remember on page 62, Bill Wilson said, selfishness, self-centeredness is the root. And in the next paragraph, the starting sentence is, so our troubles are of our own making. Intellectually, we could probably see that somewhat and understand the words. But now we're going to look at them in technicolor, experientially. He has 5 questions here. Where had I been selfish? Doesn't give us a definition of what that means. Where had I been dishonest? Doesn't give us a definition. Self-seeking doesn't give us a definition. Frightened doesn't give us a definition. Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we're looking at both sides of it, and we are seeing that they did something nasty. That is correct, but we're not looking at that anymore. We're looking at our reaction to it. Only focused on my reaction, my thoughts, my perceptions, my feelings, my behavior. We tried to disregard the other person entirely. We're looking at it from a totally different angle. Not coming from the outside in, but only looking at the inside, taking it personally. And the 5th question, the final question, the question that parts the curtain. Where am I to blame? Now, I personally don't like that word any more in contemporary language. I don't think that it's as clean and as healthy as it could be. Maybe in 1939 it was just fine. The implication is really, where am I responsible? What's my role in this? The inventory is ours, not the other person's. Whose anger is it? No. Stop, breathe. Really hear the question. Whose anger is it? Oh, it's mine. Where did my anger come from? Inside of me. It's my feeling. It's my emotion. I generated it. It's my reaction. This is the potential for a spiritual awakening right here. It was mine. I didn't realize it at the time. But after I finished my 4th column, especially after I finished the 5th step on it, it was embarrassing because I was aware that I was 100% responsible for my life, for my perceptions, for my feelings, for my thoughts, and especially for my behavior. 100%. I realized that I do not have a part, please hear me, I do not have a part in my resentment. I'm responsible for the whole thing, 100%. Circumstances, events, and people do not have a part in my resentment. They just do what they do, and I take it personally. And sometimes it's meant personally, but it's my reaction to it that is my problem. I have no influence, very little, over people and places, events, and circumstances. It's my reaction that is my problem. When I saw my fault, see, this is my brokenness. I listed them. I placed them before me in black and white. That's what this worksheet is all about. Putting it down in writing and being succinct. This is not psychology. This is not therapy. This is not catharsis. If you need to do that on a separate piece of paper or in a separate process. But here, stay with the worksheet and stay within the space allotted. It'll force you to get laser focused. We admitted our wrongs honestly. It's unhealthy. And we suffer because we think we're justified. We think it's right. Don't you understand who my father was? Don't you understand what my life was? Don't you understand what the incident was? Yeah, I do actually. Criminal, sad, tragic, traumatic, life-changing, irreversible. Yeah, all of that. Yep. Deal with it. I don't want to be cold or dismissive, but that's the only conclusion. Deal with it. We were willing to set these matters straight. This is where he alludes to the work that you will do in step 8, looking at the harms that you've done as the result of your reaction and retaliation, looking at how you need to change your behavior with regard to others and certainly perhaps repair some damage. Not all the time is there a connection between harm and resentment. Please get clear on that too. Not every resentment leads to harm. And not every harm has resentment. But we'll talk more about that when we unpack step 8. And so in the Way of Life document, you have a 4th column. Of course, I suggest, it's on page 25, I suggest prayer. I'll set aside prayer. This is one of the harder steps to not understand and do, but to accept. I lose a lot of people in the step work in my on-the-ground workshops here because they're not willing to accept that their life is exactly what it is because of their reactions and not because of anything else. Tough medicine. Again, repeat the resentment at the top, but then craft my perceived role. You remember in the 3rd column, I suggested that you use the theater analogy to help you understand self-esteem and pride. Put yourself on a stage in relationship to the person or circumstance. Self-esteem. And then ask yourself, how do you want the audience to see that whole play? Pride. Well, I'm continuing using that theater analogy here, where I asked you to, what is your perceived role? In other words, if you were the author, the script writer, what would be the 1 or 2 or 3 words that would be used in the script to designate this particular part in the play? So with Bob, for instance, who I used as my model for unpacking the 3rd column, my peer who tried to get me fired. So I was a misunderstood employee. I mean, that's tame, but it's relatively real. I just really felt he didn't understand me. I'm 4 years sober now. I'm not the old Herb, I'm the new Herb. I don't drink anymore. I don't cause that kind of chaos because I didn't know that I didn't know, and I couldn't see that I didn't see that I had not changed. I was still behaving in the same way I had behaved when I was drinking. Probably less obviously, but every bit as negatively impactful on the people in my surroundings. And I didn't know it and I couldn't see it. Because I had this sense that I'm sober now, so all should be forgiven. Wrong. No. They don't know what it means even to be sober. And they certainly don't cut me any slack just because I'm doing what normal people do. Be responsible. So my perceived role is I am a misunderstood employee. And it is true. Remember it said, imagine fancied or real in the material on the deep resentment, fancied or real. In other words, did it actually happen, the event? I found when I asked that question, about 5% of the resentments I had no basis in reality, none at all. I don't actually know where they came from. They had no basis in reality. Not a terribly important question, but still having some significance. And then the 5 questions that I just identified on page 67. But I've turned them into definitions so that we can attempt to answer those questions more specifically based on my experience. I use self-seeking as a word for my behavior. It's arbitrary. I made up the definition based on the work that the man was giving me and his help in crafting the definitions. How did I behave when I felt put upon by Bob being misunderstood? I tried harder, I manipulated, I was dishonest. I certainly was insensitive to his needs and dismissive of his person and his comments. Selfish, number 2, misrepresenting myself. Selfish, thinking about myself. In contrast to self-seeking, which was about behavior, selfish is about thinking. Well, I still had this sense that I'm the center of the universe. Not just the center of my universe, which is the truth. I am the center of my universe. I still had this delusional belief that I'm the center of the universe. You see, I hadn't confronted my own narcissism at this point. It was step 4 through 7, and then some therapy that I was receiving for outside help that helped me really identify not only was I self-centered in the spiritual sense, but I was narcissistic in the psychological sense. I had literally a character flaw that was diagnosable in the DSM. And you can take a look at that description in the 6th step in the Way of Life document if you care to pursue it. It has 9 characteristics, and I found that it was embarrassing but revealing and helpful to me to own then how other people were seeing me. They were seeing the truth and I was living a delusion. 3, dishonest. How am I misrepresenting myself? Well, I was representing myself as a competent person who was eligible for this promotion, and in fact, I wasn't. I hadn't prepared for it. My motives were askew, as I've confirmed in earlier conversations. I was more interested in the money, the prestige, and the power that came with the position than I was in terms of the responsibilities and the opportunity to help the company and the people in the company. afraid, fear of not getting what I want. I was not only afraid of not getting the job, I was afraid of being fired. It was huge. Almost disabling, the fear got to that kind of level. Where am I wrong, at fault, to blame? See, I use the word responsible here. It's not in the big book, but I think it's a healthier word, meaning capable of making a response for my feelings when I feel this resentment. And I use the then, at the time, 1988, and now, when I was doing this work, was also 1988, so that they were contemporary, both the feeling and the activity. Sometimes it might be like when I had my resentment toward my father, he was 12 years dead. So I was looking back over my youth, my young adulthood, my adulthood, when I was looking at my feelings of reaction to my father. But the most relevant time frame is now. The event may have been yesterday, but the event may have been 40 years ago. My dad was 12 years dead, even at the time I was doing this in 1988. And I had this deep rage. So the most relevant time frame is now, as I'm doing this work. I have this anger right now about an event that happened 10 years, 20 years, 40 years ago. So many people have deep anger toward their mother and father, both or one or the other, going back decades, blaming them for their lives. And it is true. Rather than a source of formation, which is their appropriate role, healthy role, they were a source of deformation. It is true. It's criminal, it's tragic, it's psychological, it's life-changing. Yep, all true. And irreversible. You'll never have a different history. So now it's about you dealing with it, dealing with your reaction to it, not trying to change the history, but trying to change your reaction to it. It's also setting us up for some additional work. I'm about efficiency, and as long as I'm looking at this resentment, 6 and 7 are about looking at harms. I'm not going to go through that right now because it's not that critical for doing the 4th column. Eventually, or maybe even as you're doing it, you can put down some notes, but it's about parking spot so that you can come back and do some additional analytical work when you get to step 8. The same with question number 8. It's about fears, not to be unpacked here, but to be recognized and acknowledged, because the very next inventory we do is about fear. This one's about anger. The next one's about fear. So this also is grist for the mill, setting you up to do some additional work later on, as well as question number 9 about character defects. It's setting you up to do some work in step 6. A side note, once you finish your 4th step and do your 5th step, don't burn it. Don't throw it away. It's the source of step 6. It's the source of the preparation for step 8. At the conclusion of step 9, when you've finished all your amends, it might be appropriate for you to, in some ritual or non-ritualistic way, to get rid of your 4th and 5th step material and notes. A conversation we'll have later on. Looking at character defects at this point was really a critical piece of ownership of the resentment. It was very helpful to see my narcissistic behavior, the dishonesty, the inappropriate dealings with the leadership, with my coworkers, with my subordinates. my insensitivity to their needs, my lack of concern with anything but myself, all of the ramifications of the narcissistic personality. And then question number 10, why do I hold on to this resentment? What's the benefit? What's the value? A lot of people immediate response, oh no, it has no value. Well, quite frankly, it does. Otherwise, you wouldn't have it. You hold on to it, you nurture it, you grow it, unconsciously most of the time. But you have these negative feelings because they somehow are interpreted as helping you survive. They are a benefit. You may not see it, you may not know it, but until you acknowledge it and accept it, they won't go away. They serve some value, some benefit. There's no formula here. There's just the question. That's why the set-aside prayer is so important. And then the question at the bottom is the reverse of the question at top. That's why it's in a box. At the top it says, my perceived role, misunderstood employee. Well, the truth is, my real role, they understood me correctly. I was, rather than a eligible person for their promotion, I was ineligible. That's pretty tame. My perceived role, I'm a really nice guy, deserving of, and I'm misunderstood. No, they understood me correctly. I did not understand myself. My perceived role is I'm misunderstood. The real role is just the reverse. I didn't understand myself. I had a delusion, deep delusion, that I couldn't see and I didn't know. I now realize I'm a delusional man, a narcissistic man. And that was the beginning of the turnaround for me in terms of a spiritual awakening. I call it based on Byron Katie's work. Byron Katie, yeah. Loving What Is. After I'd done a lot of work, some people brought her work to my attention. You may want to read the book, Loving What Is, because especially once we've done the work in column 3 and column 4, column 3 is what we believe, and we begin to see the distortions and unhealthy beliefs that we have. Column 4 is the truth, our motives, reality as it probably is, something that I never really had encountered. And so it's kind of like going from north to south. Byron Katie calls it the turnaround, and I like to use that term now. It's the turnaround where the curtain parts. And rather than believing the lie that is my belief of the third column, I begin to accept the truth, which is revealed in the fourth column. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. We'll continue with the column 3, column 4 work. I think this is really productive. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Oh my goodness. The courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. That's what we want, wisdom. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Herb.
You bet.